Hello. Today I wanted to take a step back from books because there's so much more to read than what's in a book. And although books have sort of found a renaissance lately, I don't know if people remember this, but Barnes& and Noble was literally going bankrupt before the pandemic. And then books became so popular because everyone was stuck inside and was running out of quarantine TV that they started reading again. One industry that hasn't really recovered is the magazine industry. I was sort of talking about this with my brother, and that we were joking around, and I was saying like what a good bit it would be to be like really into magazines in the year 2024, because there's people who are super into vinyl record collecting. I personally collect CDs. There's people who are super into like old film stock, things like that. But no one really seems to be into magazines, which is sort of another form of media that, although it still exists, is sort of not of this generation, not really part of the cultural discussion anymore. People aren't really reading magazines. But websites like The Cut basically are doing the journalistic work that and have filled the gap that magazines were occupying. The big ones that really couldn't afford to go digital or just survive the like major online shift that happened in the mid 2000s to 2010s suffered. So now the only real magazines left are like the major ones. But I think this is a conversation that's been had specifically around women's magazines and how much they've changed in the last 10 years, because if anyone has opened a Vogue or a Teen Vogue recently, specifically Teen Vogue actually, some of the articles that they're publishing are hard-hitting journalism, talking about real current event issues, things that affect women but also just affect like a global community, and they're doing like really excellent reporting in Teen Vogue, and that is like such a shift from what that magazine was when I was a child. So that's super interesting. I don't know, all of this is sort of rambling. I was really curious after that discussion with my brother about like, should I be that person? Should I like semi for the bit but also not for the bit get into magazines? And the answer is yes. And I got into them. Specifically, I just picked up whatever magazines my parents haven't canceled our physical subscription to, and discovered that I really enjoy reading them. And we're gonna go through some of them and basically go through like what was in these issues of these magazines that I read. And I'm gonna talk about why I feel like they're worth reading, because I literally want to start the magazine revolution. I really feel like everyone should be reading magazines again. And I'm going to start with like a massive thesis statement that I feel like if you are sick of social media and you feel like you can feel your brain rotting, and during maybe, I don't know, an election season, Twitter is making you have a panic attack every time you open the app, like me, then maybe it's time to switch to magazines. Yeah, that's my thesis, so let's go through it. So, I read 2 magazines in preparation for this video. I was actually going to read 3, but I couldn't get to it in time. The first magazine I read was the New York Times Magazine for October 20th. It's November 1st when I'm filming this, so all of these are about 10 days behind because it just took me a long time. It took me a long time. I will get to that. So, New York Times Magazine for October 20th. This was the cover. Gorgeous photography. I really like it. And the cover story is, "Are we almost out of cheap milk?" I read this in a day. I read in like an hour, to be honest. Then I hit trouble. So, obviously, I don't feel like a literary discussion about magazines could be held without discussing New Yorker. We're going to do that. I read the October 21st issue of The New Yorker. It took me a very long time to read it because I was just taking my sweet time. My original plan was to listen. As I said when I started this video, I wasn't previously a magazine reader. If I ever read an article, it was online. It was either for a class or because people were discussing it on Twitter or whatever. Maybe my mom sent it to me. So I don't even know that I'd ever read a print issue of the New Yorker. So forgive me for saying I thought it was a monthly magazine. I was actually planning on doing a series where I read each month's issue of the New Yorker, like, with you, and then posted it so that it was like every month, like a New Yorker reading club or something. Come to find out, it's a weekly magazine. So as I was leafing breezily, acting like I had all the time in the world through the October 21st issue, I received in the mail the October 28th issue. I hadn't even opened this one. That sent me sort of spiraling, where I was like, okay, so what is this video going to be? I was lost. I was confused. And it just took me a while to figure it out. So I still haven't figured it out, but I was like, let me just start making the video because I've read these two magazines and I want to talk about them. I haven't even opened this one, and then yesterday I got the November 4th issue of the New Yorker, so I'm now 2 issues behind. I don't really feel like posting a weekly video. Also, these magazines are surprisingly dense. Like, you know, like, my life is demanding. It's not. I have a part-time job, but basically what I want to do, I think, is catch up on issues I'm now an issue behind. I'm going to catch up, hopefully, and then every month I will post a synthesis that is like my favorite articles that I read this month in the New Yorker. Maybe. I think I'm going to do that, but if I start doing that and it sucks, I'm going to stop. So yeah, I feel like let's just get into it. Here's what I read in the October 20th issue of the New York Times Magazine. The first article is from their section called Screenland, and it is entitled No Stranger. Hollywood's fictional presidents never quite anticipated the kinds we've had lately, by Ross Barkan. If you listened to that first sentence and thought, wow, that's a really bad sentence, I would agree with you. This is a bad sentence. Hollywood's fictional presidents never quite anticipated the kinds we've had lately. If I were editing this article for you, I would say change that sentence, but whatever. Then he, I think, tries to go for some sort of, listen, sometimes when people don't have good ideas, they will cite other people who famously had good ideas as a way to sort of cloak that their own ideas are not that good. And if a person is citing another great thinker within the first sentence of their article or what have you, the chances are high that they don't have much to say for themselves. Not always, but it's probably one of my least favorite framing devices for an article. Anyway, this person, Ross Barkan, starts by referencing Philip Roth, who once said that the American writer has his hands full in trying to understand and then describe and then make credible much of the American reality. This is obviously a very prescient. So I was doing sort of a combo of the British and the American. Prescient. Really? We say prescient? Prescient. Interesting. Somewhere across the Atlantic I got lost. Ross Barkan opens with that. So then he goes from there to sort of talk about how, like, film and books and all these mediums of art have a very hard time capturing how insane American politics is, which is a very interesting point, or could be an interesting point. I highlighted the following section. Showrunners and movie makers never really foresaw a presidency quite like either of the last two or a campaign like this one. Their work has underestimated both what the American political system is capable of producing and what voters could ultimately stomach, which is a very interesting and I believe true point. He says that there is a halo of dignity around the office itself on TV, or especially like in previous eras of American history. There's always been, even if you had disagreed with the president, there's always been this like respect given to the office that kind of doesn't exist anymore. And he says, idealism is out. We can no longer imagine a noble president. We can barely be entertained by a generically well-meaning one. So the issue I had with this article is he sort of starts bringing up random film and TV references that have like famous depictions of a president, like of a fictional president. And then he sort of is saying like, oh, well, if Harris wins, then it's similar to Commander-in-Chief, which is a TV show, or Veep. But I was like, okay, why are we just finding comps? Like, I just, like, what's the point of you saying that if your argument is actually that we can't even find a correlation between TV and our actual political scene? I just felt like the argument was interesting, but he just didn't make me, like, I just didn't know why I was supposed to, like, care. But he does say, Hollywood remains beholden to what I call the savvy school of imagination. It dreams up politicians who tend toward the smooth, cutthroat, and wholly rational. Their every action is premeditated. And I would agree that I feel like in storytelling, that is the kind of politician we see. Not only is that like more comforting, but I actually think it works better in a storytelling sense for someone's actions to be premeditated, for them to be intelligent. Because if you're just watching people fumble around blindly and like have their hand on the nuclear button, then it's like a less interesting watch, and also obviously a much more anxiety inducing watch. That was that article. Then we go into one of my favorite columns from this magazine called The Ethicist. I've actually read this column before. This is sort of an advice column, but because it is labeled The Ethicist, although he is giving advice, his advice is coming from a sort of like ethically philosophical place, like almost Kantian, and he kind of pulls no punches with people. This person has written in to say that their son has a horrific gambling problem, and that his parents are constantly bailing him out. They want to know if they need to tell his partner because he hasn't told her, and they're gonna get like married. So the ethicist Kwame Anthony Appiah says you 100% need to help your son, make him go to rehab, but like telling the partner yourself should be the last resort, which I agree with. Sometimes he's super mean to these people and it's hilarious. But this one's like sad. So then we had an article called Unsolved Mysteries, Letter of Recommendation. I didn't even read this. Oh yes, I did read this and it was boring and I forgot that I read it. Letter of Recommendation. This section has an article entitled Unsolved Mysteries. And it was about a random archaeological site discovered in Margate, England, and people don't really know what the site was used for, or like what the things that were buried were used for, or whatever. And they still haven't figured it out. And this person is sort of like grappling with the idea that like maybe it's better not to know things. It was kind of boring. Okay, then there was a recipe for stew. I didn't read. Nothing against stew. Then we got to our cover story, which was called Expiration Dates, or maybe, I don't know what it was called. I think it was called Expiration Date. Undocumented labor quietly props up much of the American economy, nowhere more than on dairy farms. What would a crackdown mean for milk? And this was written by Marcela Valdez. This is the cover photographed by Balaz Gardi. Hope I pronounced that correctly. This was a very interesting article. And then here's where I want to get to a point I have about magazines and social media. Sometimes when you're talking to someone and you're like, oh yeah, I read recently where blah, 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 and actually what you're referencing is a TikTok. What you could do is read an article, and then what you get to say in conversation is, actually, I read this article recently in the New York Times Magazine about undocumented labor on dairy farms. And not only do you sound smarter, you actually are. Also, you have a better grasp of the topic you're about to yap about. And because these articles are written to be like you sit and read it and digest it, within like 25 minutes, they're literally designed for conversation. Like, not literally, but they make perfect conversation topics, because if you can sit and digest this article in 25 minutes, you can talk about it in 5. So I have, since reading this article, brought it up probably like 10 times in different conversations. Every single time it's been a conversational success. yeah, like what else to even say about that? Like that's great. And that I got so much farther with this article than I would if I was just citing a tweet I had seen. So yeah, this article was super interesting and I recommend people read it. Follows one specific dairy farmer and the people who work at his farm. He started it in the 70s, like typical American farmer story. And at this point, he has many workers who milk his cows for him. And although he like checks their paperwork, he knows that probably a lot of them are undocumented. But he like can't afford to like turn away those people. This is a farm in Iowa where the dairy industry has grown like exponentially. Even within the last 10 years, it's really taken over. And Iowa is a very conservative state. A lot of state legislators want to crack down on illegal immigration. That's sort of a major theme within the Republican Party right now, and also the Democratic Party, to be honest. And this article was exploring like what that crackdown would mean, not only for like the individual farmer, but the industry at large and thus the economy. And they basically were saying that the likely outcome would be that the entire state of Iowa and the dairy industry in America at large would completely collapse. And Iowa as a state would turn into like West Virginia when the coal mines were shut down. Some phrases I highlighted. After November's election, a reckoning for the dairy industry could become a national concern. Democrats, for their part, have met these threats with relative silence, a sign of the public's growing intolerance for migrants. I thought that sentence was super interesting because, yes, I have noticed a trend where the Democratic Party is on immigration policy. The Democratic Party has definitely gotten a lot stricter, a lot harsher, and a lot more aligned with the Republican Party, which I think speaks to a national fear and wariness of migration and undocumented people in the country. Oh, sorry, I said Iowa, but it's Idaho. No, it's not. Wait, it is? Wait, this was Idaho? That's crazy. This whole time I thought it was Iowa. I think while I was reading the article, I literally thought I was reading about Iowa, so that's crazy. It's Idaho. Idaho is also a red state, I believe. So Idaho has not voted for a Democrat for president since 1964. So an economist at the University of Idaho's College of Agricultural and Life Sciences named Philip Watson says, I don't think anyone really thinks that this is going to help Idaho, this being a bill that would crack down on undocumented labor. There's just this idea that it's what we have to be doing because it's the right thing to do, which is, I fully agree. I think most immigration policy is basically formed around this concept that it's wrong to enter a country without a visa, even though countries are fictional and visas are fictional. And I mean fictional, they are not actually real. They are a shared idea. And then he says, people have seen this for decades. When the coal mine shut down in West Virginia or the steel mill shuts down in Pittsburgh, it's not just the mill and the mill workers that are affected, it's entire communities. And basically, the dairy industry will be affected because the vast majority of workers in the dairy industry are undocumented immigrants. It's convenient to imagine that removing these adults from the labor force would create drastically more jobs and better wages for U.S. citizens, but that's not likely. You're not substituting like 500 nannies with 500 US-born nannies, the economist Joan Monraz told me. I don't think that's ever going to happen. Some consumers will change their behavior rather than spend more money. Dual-income households, for example, might decide that one parent needs to quit. That I found was super interesting in terms of like gender, because a lot of women are able to have full-time jobs because they have poor women of color and usually immigrants taking care of their children for them. I do know that probably a vast majority of people working in childcare who are immigrants are probably undocumented or have like some issue with their legal status. Maybe they're here on asylum, but they don't have green cards. Like, I don't know. And so if we totally crack down on immigration, then probably what would happen is more U.S. citizen women in the middle classes or above would have to leave their jobs and start taking care of their kids full time, like be stay-at-home moms, because they can't afford help anymore. I think often white women, specifically in middle class and above white women, actually all classes of white women, tend to vote against their own best interests. Also, a lot of white women's best interests is on the backs of more impoverished women of color and immigrants. So that, I feel like, is an article in and of itself that I would love to read. Undocumented immigrants make up only a small fraction of the American labor force, about 5% in 2022. So while their removal may create a lot of short-term disruptions, over the long run, it won't generate significant benefits. Then they go on to say there has been very little consideration of the effects a more draconian immigration policy could have on food prices. Because obviously if the dairy industry is like majorly affected, that will drive up the cost of milk and dairy products, and milk and eggs and products such as that tend to be pretty consistently priced. That's something that's mentioned more at the beginning of the article, that comparatively, those prices don't rise as quickly or as steeply as other consumer goods. So it is sort of a staple food product in most American families, and it's something that a lot of people depend on, especially like to make sure that kids are getting enough like calcium and protein. Milk is a major thing in the US, like in culture at large. So if those prices would skyrocket basically if we crack down on undocumented labor. The next article is called The Wizard of Winnipeg. It's written by Mark Benelli, and it is about this director, Guy Maddin. He also co-directs with two of his former students, and it was about his movie that just came out called Rumors, which is now on my watch list because of this article. So that was super cool. Don't really feel like I need to get too much into it. It sort of just talked about his background, and it was fun to read. I've never seen any of Guy Maddin's movies, but it definitely made me want to watch some of them. So then there was this really insane article called DEI, the Michigan Experiment. This was written by Nicholas Confessore, and the blurb is, a leading public university built one of the most ambitious diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the country. What went wrong? So this is about the University of Michigan. DEI has become one of the latest boogeymen in conservative talking points. I wouldn't say that this article skews conservative, because it's more questioning whether or not DEI works. And I feel like Republicans assume that it does, which is, I think, so funny. Sometimes when I hear Republicans talk about what the Democratic Party is doing, or like things like DEI, it's like, wow, I kind of wish we lived in that world. Like, I wish I lived in a world where DEI worked. Not that it doesn't work, but it definitely doesn't do enough. And it has a lot of flaws. And so this article was sort of exploring the flaws of the DEI program at Michigan. But it definitely starts to skew more into like this boomer centrist idea of like woke mob, like the kids are too weak now and they're mad at their professors for making racist jokes. And I just like, and I would beg the author of this article to spend even a day at my alma mater, because people could start a political debate about literally anything. I literally had a friend called an eco-terrorist once. Liberal arts colleges. Okay. So what I highlighted here was the students that are most affected by DEI, meaning marginalized communities, are invested in the work, but not in DEI itself. And the person who said that was the speaker of the university's Black Student Union, Princess Jamaria Maboop. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that last name. Her statements were all very cogent and delightful to read. So author said that her discontent reflected a tension I found threaded throughout DEI at Michigan, a pervasive uncertainty around whom and what DEI is really for. It sort of goes into the history of Michigan's DEI program, and then sort of like how they've tried to course correct in various ways throughout the years, and all of those course corrections have been largely unsuccessful. And it also talked about how DEI has become their way of combating the repeal of affirmative action. Michigan, as a state, I believe, repealed a lot of affirmative action policies even before the Supreme Court got rid of affirmative action in like either this year or last year. So DEI has sort of stepped in as like furthering affirmative action policies, and it's not really working, but like they're trying. Academic psychologist Robert M. Sellers was a veteran of Michigan's long struggle over race, because they obviously had very, very low Black enrollment in the 1970s, and people were like protesting that and saying that they needed to make that a priority to increase enrollment of Black students. And they have, but then it like dropped again. So that was really interesting. It like rose in the 90s and now it's back to like 6%, which is crazy. Michigan has like 40,000 people. Sellers recommended that Michigan adopt its first strategic plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion, a natural experiment, as Michigan officials would later describe it, in whether a university could increase student body racial and ethnic diversity by race-neutral means. So I thought that was a super interesting way of framing DEI as like the stand-in for affirmative action. How can you increase racial and ethnic equality and diversity if you can't really talk about race or ethnicity or like factor that into your decision making? Then it got into the like professors fighting with their students and woke mob students storm out of professors' lecture. I was just starting to have like issues with the tone here, where they were talking about a English professor read a passage out loud that contained a racial slur, and his student got really upset and left, and then ended up emailing him and being like, I really didn't like that you read that. I feel like there was a different way to like go about this or whatever. And he was like, oh, so now I'm not allowed to read texts that have racial slurs in them, like Toni Morrison has racial slurs in her text. And it's like, all right, okay, I feel like you're intentionally misunderstanding why she was uncomfortable with that. Then the student was interviewed in the article, and she said like that specifically hearing her professor say that word was like triggering for her because of racial violence she's experienced as a student on campus as part of the 6% of Black students on Michigan's campus. Like, she has faced discrimination from other students, and so it was like hard for her to go into the classroom and hear those words. The author of the article clearly thinks that she was being overdramatic and is siding with the professor, and I just whatever. So basically, she leaves the room, and then she emails him, and she said, I don't take issue with reading stories with the N-word in them. I understand the time period and that it's a work of fiction. I do take offense when non-Black people say the N-word. Then the professor said that he wasn't sure what difference there was between reading the text and hearing it, but added that he took her point. And then she responded, I simply am not in a place where I could keep my emotions composed when having a stressful conversation at the moment. I have really enjoyed your class and enjoyed having you as professor. I would like you to consider that I have experienced that word coming from non-Black people. I feel like that email sounds like she was very well composed. She wasn't trying to attack him. She wasn't trying to like gotcha him or like have him canceled on Twitter or whatever. And yet the article sort of makes it seem like she's being really dramatic, and I don't feel like she is. So then the Title IX office increased like by a very significant size. And I highlighted a passage that said, to some extent, those increases reflected a newfound willingness to challenge behaviors that might once have been swept under the rug. Yet accusations of racism and sexism were easily wielded, some faculty members told me, in what they considered intellectual or personal disputes. So this example, I really sided with the students here. Basically, a male professor who teaches a class on entrepreneurship, opened the semester with a written disclaimer. What I apologize for in advance. It read, soft sexism, born in the 1960s, the end of the era for all moms being at home, all textbooks showing only male scientists, etc. While he would try to do a good job being balanced with my examples and being sensitive to social justice issues, students should call me on it if he failed. He considered this a good faith acknowledgement of his limitations. A student in his class, a female student, felt differently. His disclaimer raised a red flag for me, she wrote in an email to the professor. In a subsequent meeting, according to a written account he later submitted to school officials, she told him that he had wrongly asked women in the class to educate the professor about sexism and had failed to fully acknowledge his privilege. In a subsequent email, she told him that she was dropping his course. His disclaimer was extremely disrespectful and ignorant of the struggles that women and girls continue to face on a daily basis. His behavior inseparably ingrained within a larger culture of harm that exists on this campus and within the wider world. And then she filed a Title IX complaint. Then later, a few years later, she said as a female scientist student, she felt poorly supported. This was when she was interviewed by the article writer. She felt poorly supported, and that she feels like he should have used different language, but she also wishes she had handled the situation more respectfully. Though the Title IX office found no grounds for punishment, he was upset. And then he said, it's this gotcha culture they have created on campus, he told me, adding, it's like giving a bunch of 6-year-olds tasers. So here's my take on that issue. I don't know if I would have gone so far as to file a Title IX report about this, but I agree with her statement that his little disclaimer raises a red flag, because I feel like that's sort of a way for him to like deny culpability for any mistakes he makes. And instead of making that disclaimer, he doesn't need to say anything. Like, I as a woman don't need to hear that you were born in the 1960s. I don't need a male professor telling me like, oh, I'm sorry if I mess up. Don't say anything. When you mess up, own it. I just feel like putting a disclaimer like that tells me like you mess up a lot, and now I feel weird taking your class. I would 100% feel weird. I don't know, I would drop the class, but I would definitely feel like on edge, uneasy, whatever. So I understand her feelings. She clearly agrees that her own actions were like more as a result of being a woman in science and like not feeling supported in her chosen career path rather than the actual professor. And nothing even happened to him. So for him to say that it's giving a bunch of 6-year-olds tasers, which is so condescending, like everyone on a college campus, especially a school like Michigan, which is like a very good school, those people are intelligent. They deserve to be there, and they can make decisions about what is right or wrong. And like, if they feel wronged by something, they feel wronged by something. Like, that's crazy to me. But also him being like, it's a gotcha culture. Nothing happened to you, dude. Like, the Title IX office looked into it and they decided that there was no need to punish you. So sorry you got your feelings hurt. Like, her feelings were hurt. So it seems like just a situation where people's feelings were hurt, which sucks. But nothing happened to you. So I don't know why you're acting like you're a victim of gotcha culture, or like there's a bunch of 6-year-olds with tasers running around campus. So I think that was a poor choice of words. And now they're forever in this magazine. So the speaker for the BSU said, was talking about how Michigan can't create a more welcoming environment for Black students because it doesn't enroll enough of them. It couldn't enroll more of them because the environment wasn't welcoming. So it becomes a very catch-22. And I obviously don't think that is exclusive to Michigan. I think most universities are facing that same issue. The article says that DEI is meant not merely to educate students, but also to repair the world outside. Under the banner of DEI, universities like Michigan have pledged to tackle society-wide problems, which they can't really do, or at least can't do alone, and like they are still beholden to the system. And that's why DEI doesn't really work. DEI is not, as some on the right hold, a triumph of critical theory or post-colonialism, but the corporatization of higher education, in which universities have tried to turn moral and political ideals into a system of formulas and dashboards. And then Anna Khalid, who is a historian at Carleton College, said they want a managerial approach to difference. Khalid said they want no friction, but diversity inherently means friction. That was the passage that I felt like really summed up what the issues with DEI are, and I agree, it's trying to change from within the system, which often doesn't work. And that was the end of the magazine, and then I solved the crossword. There you go. I really liked the articles in here. I mean, the best article was certainly the cover story. There were much better articles in the New Yorker, but that doesn't surprise me at all. The October 21st issue of the New Yorker. But I've been talking for an hour. I don't know if I even need to talk about this. Here's what I'm gonna do. I already said I'm gonna start synthesizing my favorite articles from the New Yorker for a month. So obviously it's November 1st, so I'm gonna start reading now. And at the end of the month, I will post a video talking about the New Yorker. If you manage to get your hands on a copy of the October 21st printing of the New Yorker, I will just tell you which articles I liked the most. I really enjoyed this article entitled "The Ascent: Can Kamala Harris End the Trump Era?" which was a profile on Kamala Harris. I genuinely did feel like I learned a lot more information about her, so that was great. Oh, there was a really cool one about Birdsong called "Pecking Order" by Rivka Galchin. But 100%, they had Prison Diaries by Alexei Navalny, who was the Russian opposition leader who died in February and allegedly was killed by Vladimir Putin. It's all the posts that he managed to get out in the world while he was in prison. He was in prison for 3 years before he died, and they are insane, like heartbreaking, gut-wrenching, inspiring. His mind was just fascinating, beautiful. He's clearly a genius. Horrifying that we lost him as a thinker before he could become like the next Nelson Mandela. Honestly, like, it's just so devastating that he is dead, and I'm thankful that New Yorker published this article, because I feel like no one talks about this man anymore and what he was doing. And it's just an excellent reminder that this upcoming American election is not only about American politics, but very much also about Russian politics, because Donald Trump is a close friend and ally of Vladimir Putin, and will certainly continue that regime in the war in Ukraine, and God knows what else Putin is planning to do. So yeah, and Alexei Navalny is also the image on the cover. And God, yeah, it just made me like so sad that we couldn't have more of him in the world. He was so young, and it's just tragic. I know that his spouse, his widow, is sort of taking up the charge, continuing his work. So I'm sure she's brilliant, and I can't wait to see what she gets up to, and hopefully she doesn't die. There was a horrible short story, Skip, and a really good review of Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, written by Parul Segal, Ta-Nehisi Coates and the Temptation of Narrative, and it was just about his new book, and that was really a great review. It was not scathing, but was negative without being like rude, and it did convince me that I probably don't want to read Coates' new book, at least as a narrative about the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I think I sort of fell into the trap that a lot of well-meaning liberals fall into, which is like, oh, this guy we said was like a good thinker. He wrote about Palestine, so I should read his book instead of reading like a Palestinian person's book. But I course corrected, so I probably won't be reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, at least for that. I will probably seek out some Palestinian writers' thoughts. That was the New Yorker, just very briefly. And I will make another video about the November New Yorker and the articles I liked. I have a whole mess of editing to do now, so goodbye.